What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Iron Danger, an interesting tactical RPG that released back in 2020, I believe. But Iron Danger is a relatively short indie TRPG that focuses on some unique combat mechanics primarily, and the reason I'm taking a look at it was a viewer request actually, and after looking into it and its relatively short runtime, I decided to squeeze it in. As this is a shorter game, my exact review format, so to speak, doesn't exactly fit here, so this might seem a little more free form than my reviews typically are, so if this seems a little bit less structured, that would be pretty much why. Now, on to the rest of the video. Iron Danger is going to run you probably somewhere between 10 to 15 hours, depending on how much experience you have with these kinds of games. I finished everything in about 12, and the game itself is very linear. We will be taking on one level after another, which will provide a variety of combat encounters for us to overcome. But there's not really much in the way of side content or extra narratives to explore. It's essentially just a linear story with some basic progression systems on top of this unique combat system. The combat system sees us somewhat controlling the flow of time within a short window. This allows the game to mix up sort of real-time with pause and turn-based combat, where we can quickly iterate and try various combinations of abilities over set periods of time that the game calls heartbeats, or every half second. And that mechanic is the crux of the experience, so if what I describe here doesn't sound interesting to you, safe to say you probably won't like the game. Now, in terms of a story, we play as a young woman known as Kapuna, who sees her village attacked by Northlanders, or a more technologically advanced enemy coming from, of course, the north, and enslaving people as they go. While fleeing for our life, we fall down a pit, being impaled on a magical shard. This shard seems to belong to some sort of being rooted in Finnish fantasy, but this being and the shard we fell on effectively saves our life, while at the same time granting us magic, though we are kind of impaled by it for the rest of the game. After escaping to the sort of main capital, we're sent on a mission to collect more of these shards, as their power might just be the key to turning the tide. Now that's all I want to say story-wise, but it pretty much does what you'd expect. It's very linear, like I said. And while it's interesting enough, when the game starts to really pick up and get interesting is when the game is over, which certainly to me seems like they might have a sequel planned, though with this being an indie title, hard to say if we'll ever actually see that. Now, in terms of progression systems, every time we complete a level, one of our potentially 3 characters will get an upgrade to one of their abilities, and these are set per level. You'll get to pick an upgrade for a particular character at a particular point. So while you'll get to choose exactly what abilities to upgrade, the fact remains that these upgrades are what you have available, so the progression is very simple. There's nothing like equipment or any other system at play here. This is pretty much it. Now, your main character, as you advance the story, will actually pick up more magic shards that grant her more abilities, but that's more story related than anything else. From there, let's actually talk about the combat system a little more in depth. As I mentioned, it is a time manipulation mechanic, while at the same time being a sort of puzzle system. When you start a particular level, most of which are pretty short by the way, you're looking at maybe 10 to 15 minutes usually, the game makes an autosave, so you'll be able to reload at every single level if you want to try again from scratch, or if something goes wrong farther back than you can account for. But most of the exploration of levels is done in real time. However, once you start fighting enemies, you'll likely want to enter your trance mode, which is your time manipulation mode, which is going to enable you to rewind time back up to 5 seconds. This will let you iterate on various combat encounters or specific options therein that will potentially prevent you from taking damage. The timeline will show you exactly when you take damage, how many sections of time individual actions will take you, etc. So mastering that particular part of it is a big deal, but then there's also a tactical element to things as well. You'll be able to pick up various things like explosive barrels or Molotov cocktails to throw at enemies and sort of direct fire. There's also the occasional environmental effect to deal with, such as falling trees, stones, etc. So when you're facing a large group of enemies, you might want to look for ways to catch them off guard. There's also a backstab mechanic that will see you dealing increased damage if you can catch enemies unaware. And this is is the part of the game that shines, honestly. This tactical element alongside the time manipulation is a lot of fun to mess around with. Now, I would argue that it's not really that different from games that simply have an undo turn option, but this is admittedly a little more fun to play around with. Though I would say one thing that really kind of irked me about this is that it's impossible to just rewind altogether. You have to do it character by character, which means if you want to redirect several characters at once, you have to do that individually, which is kind of annoying. But as the game progresses and you start fighting more and varied enemies, they will have different approaches to dealing with you on top of things you have to counter, which makes you attempt to make more use of things like stealth or your magic abilities. And overall, you can have a good bit of fun with it that is relatively quick. It's not really going to eat up a lot of your time either. Unfortunately, on the flip side of that, the combat and the progression story-wise is all there is. The levels are very small, there's not really a lot of exploration, and while you can run around a little bit, there's really not much to find outside of maybe picking up some more items or health. There's no side quest, there's no exploration of a lot of the things brought up via some of the dialogue, you don't have any choices in said dialogue. Things kind of just are what they are. So while they set up a relatively interesting scenario between your kingdom of Kalevala as well as the Northlanders to the north, led by a witch queen who is enslaving people and building up these sort of iron hordes of all kinds of machinery, you don't really get to see a lot of that from any interesting perspective, and I think that's probably where the game fails to live up to some of its promise, and with it being an indie title, they probably just didn't have the resources to provide any amount of scope on that, so it kind of just is what it is. Moving right along to the Steam Deck portion of the video, I did mess around with this a little bit on the Steam Deck. Officially, the game has a rating of playable, which is down to things like the size of the text on screen as well as the controls. The game does not have controller support, which means that oftentimes the tutorial, etc. are shown as keyboard commands, so you might have to put a little extra work into figuring out the controls there, and also there is no text scaling and some of it is very small. The Steam Deck has a magnifying tool for this scenario, but certainly something to keep in mind. Otherwise, the game plays very well. You can use a keyboard and mouse layout for the Steam Deck controls, which for the most part translate pretty well. You might have to adjust one or two things, but otherwise it's a relatively simple command structure in terms of a video game, so it's certainly workable. And given the relatively tame approach in terms of graphics, etc. that we usually see with indies, hardware-wise you really shouldn't have any trouble running this either. And given its relatively shorter runtime, it might give you something to do if you are on the move or traveling or something like that, to give you something to play. But overall, pretty solid experience on the Steam Deck. But then we have our positives, negatives, and we'll wrap this thing up. Now on the positive side of things, the combat is interesting and fun to mess around with. It's very quick and snappy thanks to its time manipulation mechanic, which allows you to iterate on ideas or tactical situations pretty freely. The missions are short, so if you just want to reload them and try again, you can do that as well. And a lot of those features combine to make a system that is pretty fun for veterans, at least in passing, but also being very approachable for people who might just be trying to dip a toe into the genre, so to speak. But on the negative side, there's just nothing else to the game, really. It kind of comes down to its linear story and that combat mechanic, and if you don't like those things, you won't like anything else this game has to offer because there just isn't anything else. We don't see side quest, exploration, dialogue options, and thanks to the limited progression systems, I would almost hesitate to call this an RPG at all, but broadly speaking, I'd say the negative is simply that the game lacks a certain amount of depth, so it's hard to expect too much out of it. And that brings me to my conclusion. Iron Danger is a nice focused experience, with the highlight really being on the combat system, and that combat system is fun to mess around with. So for the first outing from the developer, Action Squad Studios, that's a pretty enjoyable piece of entertainment. Now, the game itself is going to run you $20 full price, which even for that price I don't think you're getting a bad deal by any means, but because it's been out for a few years you can find it on sale pretty regularly. I bought it personally for $2, and you can have a lot of fun with it for that price. Beyond just that, I like what they've done with this game, and I think with some expansions on any future work, they could be on to something overall. But as it stands, Iron Danger is a short, sweet, fun adventure, even if it lacks some depth. But that is going to do it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.